Without a doubt, one of the greatest movie trilogies of all time, the original Star Wars trilogy, comprised of A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, is one we, as fans of the galaxy far, far away, have revisited on countless occasions. But don't be surprised if there are a few things you didn't catch along the way. Lock those S-foils in attack position and prepare to hit light speed, as myself and Josh Brown team up to tell you 60 things you somehow missed in the original Star Wars trilogy.
20 things you didn't know about Star Wars A New Hope. Number 20. George Lucas took a lower salary in exchange for full merchandising rights. In what must surely be one of the smartest business moves in Hollywood history, George Lucas made the decision to accept a lower salary of just $150,000 for Star Wars on one condition: he retained the merchandising and sequel rights for the IP. At the time, this actually seemed like a slam dunk for Fox, given that movie merch had never been a colossal money spinner, and they had very little faith in Star Wars' commercial prospects anyway. But of course, Star Wars soon enough became an unprecedented phenomenon, kickstarting an unheard of demand for action figures, lunchboxes, and so on and so forth. Between 1978 and 1979 alone, Star Wars sold $100 million worth of toys, a figure that kept snowballing until it reached upwards of $3 billion per year in recent times. Quick check, how many death sticks could you buy with that? I'm jealous. Number 19. Brian De Palma helped write the title crawl. Legendary director Brian De Palma was part of a small group of elite filmmakers, also including Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola, who provided feedback to Lucas during post-production on A New Hope. Curiously, De Palma had an especially significant impact on the film's very first moments, helping Lucas come up with a more concise and attention-grabbing opening title crawl. Initially, Lucas's crawl was 6 paragraphs consisting of 4 sentences each, until an exasperated De Palma insisted he cut the spiel down to a more manageable length. De Palma, never one to mince words, allegedly called the crawl gibberish and helped Lucas ruthlessly cut through the guff to correct the crawl used in the final film. Number 18. George Lucas originally prevented Harrison Ford from auditioning. Can you believe it? Lucas originally didn't want Harrison Ford to play Han Solo. His reasoning? Ford had a small role in Lucas's acclaimed second feature film American Graffiti back in 1973, and the director wanted to use an entirely new roster of names and faces for Star Wars. However, Ford, who was working as a carpenter at the time, agreed to help Lucas audition other actors for Star Wars' roles. After hearing Ford read Solo's lines, however, Lucas decided to ditch his rule and hire the actor to play the now iconic smuggler turned rebel hero. Number 17. The original editor was fired during post-production. Star Wars' post-production process was a well-noted nightmare, to the extent that original editor John Jimpson, who had worked on films like Zulu, A Hard Day's Night, and Frenzy, was even fired during the cutting process. Jimpson, who wasn't Lucas's first choice to edit the film anyway, cut Star Wars for its first work-in-progress screening, which was a reportedly disastrous mess due to poor pacing, an incoherent narrative, and an excess of expository dialogue. Lucas responded by firing Jimpson and instead asking his wife Marcia to reshape the film, with the help of co-editors Paul Hirsch and Richard Chew. Number 16. Alec Guinness took a cut of George Lucas's royalties. You're probably already aware that Obi-Wan Kenobi actor Alec Guinness had complicated feelings about acting in Star Wars, deeming the material fairy tale rubbish, though nevertheless believing that it would indeed be commercially successful. Guinness's involvement was important enough to Lucas that he agreed to give him 2% of his own royalties for the film, and as added payment for some revisions Guinness made to the script, eventually bumped the number to 2.25%. This ensured Guinness became enormously wealthy throughout the decades as Star Wars' popularity soared, and as of 2009, his estate had earned a reported $95 million from the deal. Not bad for fairy tale rubbish, eh, Alec? Number 15. George Lucas deliberately avoided a G rating. It isn't often that you hear about filmmakers deliberately attempting to avoid a more permissive content rating, but that's exactly what happened with George Lucas and Star Wars. At one stage in time, A New Hope was seemingly destined for a G rating, but because this connoted a movie that was squeaky clean and wholly sanitized for the the younglings, Lucas allegedly added some mild language to the script to boost it to a PG rating. Ooh. The words hell and damn were added to get the film away from the stereotypes associated with the G rating, which is kind of weird anyway given that Star Wars is so obviously oriented towards children in the first place. Number 14. The original script was almost 300 pages long. In its embryonic stages, George Lucas's early script for Star Wars was between 250 to 300 pages long, the result of spending a year forming his ideas into a semi-coherent story. Even when it dawned on Lucas that this would simply be untenable as one feature film, he was extremely reluctant to cut anything out. And so, he decided instead to split the script into a whole trilogy, with A New Hope adapting the first third or so of that script, and with the hope that he'd get the chance to make 2 further films in the future. Number 13. It opened in just 32 theaters in North America. Fox's concern that Star Wars would be a box office failure was only exacerbated by the fact that less than 40 cinemas actually committed to screening it on its release week at the end of May 1977. On Wednesday, May 25th, Star Wars opened to a pitiable 32 cinemas, a figure that seems practically inconceivable for any blockbuster today, before opening on an additional 8 later in the week, bringing the first week total to around 40. However, the strong word-of-mouth response and incredible per-screen box office performance quickly caused the film's demand to surge with exhibitors, and throughout the summer of 1977, up to 200 extra screens were added in North America alone on a weekly basis to accommodate its popularity. During its peak in August and September 1977, Star Wars was playing on 1,000 screens throughout the US and Canada, which led to it overtaking Jaws as the highest-grossing film in North America within 6 months of its modest initial release. Number 12. John Williams almost didn't score the film. It's absolutely impossible to separate Star Wars from its wonderful composer, John Williams. The man is Star Wars, and yet George Lucas originally had something else in mind for the series' soundscape. Initially, Lucas planned to score the film only with existing classical music, in something of an homage to Stanley Kubrick doing the exact same thing on 2001: A Space Odyssey. That all changed, however, when Steven Spielberg introduced Lucas to Williams, and Williams convinced Lucas he could bring the classical romantic aspect to the film the director was craving. Number 11. The real reason George Lucas made Greedo shoot first. Of all the changes George Lucas made for the 1997 special editions of the original Star Wars trilogy, the most infamously egregious is surely the altering of the Han Greedo Cantina shootout to have Greedo shoot his gun first, so Han only kills him in self-defense and not, cold-blooded survival. The reasons for why this was a poor decision on Lucas's part are well documented, and though most simply assume that Lucas changed the scene to represent Han as a less ambiguous, more clean-cut character, the answer is actually a little more interesting than that. In Lucas's own words, Han Solo was going to marry Leia, and you look back and say, should he be a cold-blooded killer? Because I was thinking mythologically. Should he be a cowboy? Should he be John Wayne? And I said, yeah, he should be John Wayne. And when you're John Wayne, you don't shoot people first, you let them have the first shot. It's a mythological reality that we hope our society pays attention to. That in mind, you can kind of get what Lucas was going for. It's just that the edit makes the whole scene look awful, and besides, Han is way cooler with the added original darkness that shooting Greedo first provided. Number 10. Fox hated the title. Star Wars may be one of the most iconic and recognizable movie titles of all time, immediately telling you what the film is about, but during production, Fox weren't happy with it at all. Furthermore, they actually wanted to change the name, believing that Star Wars wouldn't appeal to women due to the emphasis on both sci-fi and warfare. Joke's on them, women have been in Star Wars' fandom for decades now, so suck it up, Fox. Hilariously, it's also alleged that focus groups who read the title assumed the film was a dramatization of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's tumultuous marriage. Oh god, imagine walking into the cinema with that film in your head. Number 9. The Force could originally be harnessed by ancient relics. Though Lucas eventually settled on the Force as a physically intangible object, earlier drafts of the script included a quote-unquote Kyber Crystal, a Holy Grail-esque artifact capable of harnessing and manipulating the Force. This is of course before Kyber Crystals went on to become the power source for all lightsabers, but still, it's pretty interesting to see how Lucas developed the concept of the Force over the course of the film's development. Number 8. David Prowse didn't know his Darth Vader voice was going to be dubbed over. Yikes. As with Alec Guinness, much has been written over the years about late Darth Vader actor David Prowse's fraught relationship with the franchise, namely the fact he apparently hadn't been told his voice would be dubbed over by James Earl Jones. Prowse's thick Bristolian accent led to him being called Darth Palmer on set, and the distracting nature of the accent is apparently what prompted Lucas to redub Prowse in post. Prowse insisted throughout his life that he was never told this would happen and didn't know about Jones's voiceover role until he saw the final film, which has gotta hurt. Prowse at least had the self-awareness to appreciate his accent wasn't a great fit, though nevertheless expected that he'd get a chance to redub his own voice before another actor was brought in to do it. Number 7. The C3PO suit was a nightmare for Anthony Daniels and the crew. In addition to the production's myriad other woes, George Lucas also faced an uphill struggle realizing what would ultimately become one of his most beloved creations, C3PO. For starters, actor Anthony Daniels was injured the first time he tried on the suit before shooting, his left foot being stabbed by a sharp, shattered piece of the left leg. Daniels was also unable to sit down in the suit, and so during breaks between filming typically leaned against a board instead. For the scenes where C3PO is sat down, the suit actually had to be partially disassembled. Worse still, Daniels had virtually no visibility while in the suit due to the costume's eyes being sprayed gold in order to prevent corrosion. But the character also presented additional issues for other aspects of the production. Moving around in the suit proved so noisy that the dialogue of both Daniels and any other cast member in the vicinity was rendered unusable and had to be redubbed in post. Number 6. The film was passed on by United Artists, Universal, and Disney. Before Fox stepped up and agreed to produce the film, Lucas had shopped Star Wars around to a number of studios, all of which passed on it. United Artists were the first to say no, reportedly being impressed with Lucas's vision but refusing to stump up the necessary cash to make it a reality. Next up was Universal, who believed in the commercial viability of the concept but doubted that Lucas, who was of course untested in the big budget game at that point, was the right man to execute it. But the most curious rejection came from Disney, which led Lucas to Fox, but the project finally came together. Given that Disney ended up paying $4 billion to acquire the Star Wars property in 2012, they could have probably saved themselves a fortune by getting it on the ground floor decades earlier. Number 5. Dozens of name actresses auditioned for Princess Leia. Despite there being considerable industry skepticism about A New Hope, it's still little surprise that the role of Princess Leia was intensely sought out by literally dozens of well-known and on-the-rise actresses. Just a handful of the actors who were either considered for or pursued the role include Karen Allen, Christine Baranski, Kim Basinger, Glenn Close, Gina Davis, Farrah Fawcett, Angelica Huston, Margot Kidder, Kathleen Turner, Sigourney Weaver, Jodie Foster, and even Meryl Streep. While there's little denying the incredible talents who could have played Leia, there's no replacing Carrie Fisher's indelible for the ages performance. We miss you, General. Number 4. The Millennium Falcon's design was inspired by a hamburger? George Lucas labored over the Millennium Falcon's design considerably during pre-production, even giving the original elongated design a drastic overhaul after realizing he'd unconsciously ripped off the Eagle transporter ships from the sci-fi series Space 1999. The inspiration for the Falcon's design ended up coming from a most unexpected place, a hamburger Lucas was eating. When he looked at the burger, he realized the shape of the half-eaten meat patty would help the Falcon stand out in a sea of familiar sci-fi vessels. Legend persists that the cockpit was also inspired by an olive that was on the plate next to the burger. Now that is a tasty burger. Number 3. Peter Cushing filmed his role in just 5 days. Peter Cushing's bone-chilling performance as Grand Moff Tarkin is among A New Hope's most iconic and unforgettable, and while not exactly a huge role, you still might be surprised by just how quickly Cushing filmed it. The legendary actor shot his part in just 5 days, from May 8th to May 12th of 1976, and given his esteem compared to most of the cast, he was able to command a cool salary of £2,000 per day. Today, that would amount to a staggering daily salary of almost £15,000, but such is the the cost of attracting prestige talent to a film about space wizards, that rate had to be matched. Nevertheless, Cushing absolutely earned every single penny. Number 2. George Lucas used rejected plot ideas for his future film Willow. Lucas quite sensibly threw out a number of his original ideas for Star Wars, such as having Han Solo be a noseless, green-skinned Duralian with gills. But perhaps the most interesting and not terrible of Lucas's discarded ideas is one he ended up recycling for another of his projects. At one stage, Lucas imagined Luke Skywalker and his aunt and uncle as dwarves, and though this was obviously thrown out, the filmmaker returned to the idea for the 1988 fantasy film Willow, which he both produced and conceived the story for. And number 1. It didn't premiere in China until 2015. Tough though it might be to believe, A New Hope never actually had an official premiere in China due to the nation's intensely strict ban on Western cultural influences at the time of its original release. And though copies of the film became available on home video in the years that followed, the first Star Wars didn't get the full theatrical premiere treatment until 2015, almost 40 years after it first hit screens in the West. The entire original trilogy was screened for the first time as a part of the 2015 Shanghai International Film Festival. The fact that Star Wars doesn't have decades of cultural penetration in China explains why even the recent sequel trilogy didn't drum up as much business in the region. The fond nostalgia for the IP just isn't there. 20 things you didn't know about The Empire Strikes Back. Number 20. The film's budget almost doubled during production. After the success of A New Hope, George Lucas wanted to avoid seeking financing from a major studio for the sequel in order to secure creative freedom for himself. As a result, he acquired the original $18 million production budget without any studio help, between profits from A New Hope and a bank loan he was able to secure off the back of the 1977 film's incredible commercial performance. Though the move of course paid off for Lucas in the end, The Empire Strikes Back's budget ultimately ballooned to $33 million by the end of production. This caused the nervous bank to consider calling to collect on Lucas's loan, at which point he decided to make a deal with Fox to secure the loan in exchange for a greater cut of the profits. However, Lucas got to keep his much-cherished franchise and merchandise rights, pulling off one of the greatest movie-making deals in cinema history. Number 19. Wait, Yoda originally had blue skin? Donald F. Glutt's novelization of The Empire Strikes Back features a number of differences from the final film, such as Darth Vader's lightsaber being blue rather than red, but by far the most peculiar change is the decision to have Yoda's skin be blue rather than green. A passage from the book describes Yoda as such. Yoda's long white hair was parted down the middle and hung down on either side of the blue-skinned head. But rather than Glutt simply going into business for himself, this is actually because Yoda was originally intended to be blue-skinned before George Lucas changed his mind. Number 18. Irvin Kersner had to be convinced to direct the film. Many casual Star Wars fans still forget that the best Star Wars film wasn't directed by George Lucas, but actually Irvin Kersner, Lucas's film teacher at USC School of Cinematic Arts. Kersner, whose filmmaking career largely consisted of dramedies, westerns, and thrillers, was an extremely unconventional pick to helm the Star Wars sequel, enough that the director himself even had to be talked into doing it. Kersner had little interest in making a special effects film, but Lucas convinced him he was the perfect person to ensure the character development of the piece wasn't lost in the shuffle of all those great set pieces. And so, Kersner signed on, before spending several months working with co-writer Lawrence Kasdan to polish the script. Number 17. Sir Alec Guinness was paid millions in royalties for his cameo. Much has been written about the enormous riches Alec Guinness earned, and his estate continues to earn even, for his role as Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars. And so, when Guinness was approached to reprise the role for a brief cameo in Episode 5, Guinness decided to strike a hard bargain, now being fully aware of the series' popularity. Despite being on set for less than 5 hours on a single day, Guinness negotiated to receive 0.25% of the film's box office gross, which, going by its $550.9 million box office gross, amounts to a windfall of over $1 million for a day's work. Number 16. Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher were drunk during the Cloud City introduction. In the movie's DVD commentary and also in various interviews, Carrie Fisher has mentioned that there's a very special reason why Han and Leia look so excessively peppy when meeting up with Lando Calrissian on Cloud City. They were still drunk from partying the night before. Fisher said, "I was renting Eric Idle's house for 5 months and he was doing Monty Python down in Tunisia, and they had a drink that they would give to the extras to make them more quote-unquote compliant, and they called it the Tunisian death drink. We had an early call, and Eric called down and said, 'The Rolling Stones are here,' and I came down, and it was all of them. I called Harrison and said, 'Get over here, this is ridiculous.' I wonder how he remembers it. I remember that we never went to sleep, so we weren't hungover, we were still drunk when we arrived in Cloud City the next day. We don't really smile a lot in that movie, but there, we're smiling." Damn, imagine looking that good when you've been up all night and still have Tunisian death drink coursing through your veins. Bless them both. Number 15. George Lucas quit the Writers and Directors Guilds over a credits dispute. Of all the creative battles which George Lucas found himself locked in throughout the original trilogy, one of the strangest involves the series' signature opening title crawl. When putting A New Hope together, Lucas insisted upon moving the traditional opening credits to the end of the movie in favor of the title crawl, which the Writers and Directors Guild reportedly only agreed to because they didn't expect Star Wars to be much of a success. But when Lucas understandably expected the same allowance for The Empire Strikes Back, the Directors Guild of America kicked up a massive stink, unhappy that director Irvin Kershner's name wasn't up front. They even tried to get the original prints pulled from cinemas and edited to include Kershner's name at a cost of $500,000. But considering that Kershner was entirely on Lucas's side in the first place, Lucas elected to pay a fine instead, rumored to be as high as $250,000 to keep the titles intact. To make his protest clear though, Lucas then followed up by rescinding his membership in both the WGA and DGA. Number 14. Darth Vader wasn't originally Luke's father. Another vital Star Wars figure who doesn't get nearly enough credit is Lee Brackett, who wrote the original draft for The Empire Strikes Back. Though Lucas was actually disappointed with her draft, it nevertheless bore a strong resemblance to the final script, which was subsequently worked on by Lucas and Lawrence Kasdan after Brackett's untimely death from cancer during production. But in Brackett's draft, Darth Vader wasn't in fact Luke's father, with Anakin Skywalker instead being a Force spirit who would train Luke. Only in later drafts were these attributes split between Yoda and Obi-Wan, and the shock parentage twist introduced. Number 13. Paul Ve Hoven was considered to direct. Believe it or not, legendary Dutch filmmaker Paul Ve Hoven claimed in a 2012 Q&A that he was in contention to direct the film due to the enormous popularity of his Golden Globe-nominated 1977 romantic thriller, Soldier of Orange. Ve Hoven was invited to meet with the producers and brought along a copy of his shiny new film Spetters, which quickly became infamous for its frank, graphic depictions of sex, which, as we all know, Star Wars has lots of. And so, it's perhaps little surprise that Ve Hoven never heard from the producers again about the possible Star Wars gig, presumably appreciating how thoroughly wrong the director's sensibilities were for a more commercial, family-friendly tentpole film. Number 12. Children were hired to play rebel extras. Irvin Kersner made use of one of the oldest tricks in the book to accentuate the scale of the Rebel hangar set by hiring children to play Rebel soldiers to appear in the background of wider shots. Their short stature would suggest the hangar was actually larger than it really was, and if you want to be totally cynical about it, it probably meant they didn't have to pay their extras that much either. Number 11. George Lucas campaigned for Frank Oz to get an Oscar nomination. Frank Oz was responsible for not only providing the unforgettable voice of Yoda, but also performing the on-set puppetry of the character, making him yet another vital contributor to the film's success. George Lucas was so blown away by Oz's performance that he spent thousands of dollars of his own money on an awards campaign to try and get Oz nominated for a Best Supporting Actor nod. Sadly, and as we all know, the campaign largely fell upon deaf ears, presumably because many Academy members didn't accept a combination of puppetry and voice acting as a film performance in the traditional sense, even though they definitely should have. Number 10. Lando Calrissian was originally very different. One of the more significant changes from earlier versions of the film is the depiction of Lando Calrissian. For starters, his original name was the decidedly less catchy Lando Kadar, and during a story conference he was considered to be a suave James Bond-esque character. But when it actually came to putting pen to paper, earlier drafts depicted Lando as a clone who survived the Clone Wars and led fellow clones to start their own settlement. Another backstory depicted him as a descendant of survivors of the Clone Wars, part of a family who reproduced by cloning. Needless to say, we're all pretty thankful for the Lando we actually ended up with. Number 9. 2 major crew members died before production was completed. Despite the relatively smooth nature of the production once shooting started, compared to the utter rollercoaster ride that was A New Hope at least, 2 core members of the team sadly passed away long before Empire was released. First, aforementioned screenwriter Lee Brackett died from cancer shortly after submitting her first draft, and also John Barry, who served as production designer on the original film and was hired to serve as second unit director on The Empire Strikes Back. Sadly, Barry collapsed on set just 2 weeks into filming and died of meningitis the next day, at which point Harry Cochlis was brought in to replace him. Both contributed significantly to the tone and style of Star Wars respectively, and their names absolutely need to be spoken about more loudly among the fanbase. Number 8. George Lucas featured an ice planet to challenge his effects team. George Lucas didn't merely come up with Hoth for the mere majesty of it, he very pointedly wanted to stage a battle on an ice planet because, unlike the vast blackness of space, the bright white vistas had few blind spots where the effects team could conceal their mistakes or take shortcuts. Lucas's crew likely loathed him for it, mind, but they clearly rose to the challenge, given that the Battle of Hoth remains one of the most impressive and beloved action sequences the franchise has ever delivered. Number 7. It's a rare sequel that had a staggered theatrical rollout. Generally, when a film enjoys unexpected box office success, its sequel will get a massive, immediate theatrical rollout, yet that wasn't the case with The Empire Strikes Back. The film actually premiered in a limited number of cinemas in larger cities because its initial run was presented in 70mm, which only a fraction of cinemas were actually equipped to project. It wasn't until many weeks later that the film began its 35mm rollout worldwide, and surely left anyone without a 70mm cinema nearby absolutely fuming. At least spoilers were a little easier to avoid in 1980 without Twitter and the like, unless of course you were unlucky enough to have Homer passing you by in line. Number 6. James Earl Jones thought Darth Vader was lying about Luke's parentage. Though some fans at the time doubted Darth Vader's claim that he was Luke Skywalker's father, this also transpired through to at least one member of the cast, given that Vader's voice himself, James Earl Jones, assumed it was a lie intended to manipulate Luke. Jones believed this until he finally sat down to read the script for Episode 6 a few years later, and given that Jones's voiceover is one of the more compartmentalized aspects of the production, it's entirely possible he wasn't given the script until after principal photography was completed. Number 5. Part of the Hoth sequence was filmed outside the cast and crew's hotel. Much of the Hoth sequence was filmed in Finnsey, Norway, and true to the series' poor luck with inclement weather, the crew arrived to shoot just as the region's worst winter storm in 50 years swept through. For a time, the cast and crew were confined to their hotel and unable to shoot at their planned location, but out of frustration, Irvin Kersner eventually decided to film part of the sequence where Luke ambles through the snow just 30 feet from the front door of the hotel. Number 4. Han Solo was frozen in carbonite because Harrison Ford wasn't confirmed to return. The film's famously bleak ending sees, among other things, Han Solo frozen in carbonite and passed off to Boba Fett, but there's one very particular reason that George Lucas decided to leave Han in limbo between movies. As it turns out, Harrison Ford wasn't sure if he would be returning for the third film, even asking Lucas to kill him off in Empire, so to cover his hide in case Ford decided not to come back, his fate was left up in the air between films. Unlike Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill, Ford never agreed to sign a 3-picture deal, which in retrospect seems like a huge gamble on Lucas's behalf. Thankfully, of course, it all worked out in the end, and we all got the epic conclusion we all wanted. Number 3. 8 R2-D2s were made for the movie. A staggering 8 different versions of R2-D2 were used throughout Empire. 2 were lighter and more padded for actor Kenny Baker to fit inside, while there were 3 dummy versions which could be damaged if need be, and a further 3 which were remotely controlled for locomotion. This seemingly excessive number of RT units was due to numerous issues the production had on A New Hope with the original aluminium models in terms of movement and comfort. Empire's R2-D2 units were instead made out of fiberglass and by all accounts made this aspect of the production far less of a headache for both Baker and the crew. Number 2. Han's I Know wasn't improvised by Harrison Ford. It's often stated by fans that Han's utterance of I know in reply to Leia's declaration of love for him was improvised by Harrison Ford on the spot, but that's actually not the case. Rather, Ford and Irvin Kersner discussed the scene before shooting and settled on the new dialogue, which reportedly led to Fisher being upset that she wasn't included in the process, and Lawrence Kasdan irritated that his words had also been altered. The fact that Ford hashed it out with Kersner is confirmed by an excerpt from Alan Arnold's 1980 book Once Upon a Galaxy, a journal of the making of Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, where it's made abundantly clear that Ford talked it over with Kersner before the camera started to roll. So it's still quintessentially Ford, but it wasn't as spontaneous as people like to think. And number 1. David Prowse guessed the Darth Vader twist 2 years before release. There's another piece of mythic Star Wars trivia which, while rooted in truth, has been totally misrepresented over the years. It's often stated that Darth Vader actor David Prowse spoiled the ending to Empire Strikes Back in a 1978 interview where he mentioned that Luke would turn out to be Darth Vader's son. While Prowse's loose-lipped confession has often been spoken as fact, it's actually far more likely that Prowse simply made a lucky guess, given that only George Lucas, Irvin Kersner, Lawrence Kasdan, and Mark Hamill actually knew about the reveal until the late stages of production when James L. Jones was brought in to provide his voiceover. Furthermore, Prowse was given a dummy line while shooting the scene, which was "Obi-Wan killed your father," which is absolutely bonkers. Ultimately, all that secrecy was pretty much for naught though, given that the film's novelization was released a month before the actual movie, spoiling the big twist far ahead of time regardless, just like the Phantom Menace soundtrack did with Qui-Gon's death years later.
20 things you didn't know about Return of the Jedi. Number 20, it was almost called Revenge of the Jedi. During the scripting stage, co-writer Lawrence Kasdan claims he told George Lucas that his original title, Return of the Jedi, was weak, prompting George Lucas to change it to Revenge of the Jedi. This decision held firm enough that it was included in the original teaser trailer, until 5 months before the film's release, when Lucas had a change of heart, feeling that the word revenge wasn't appropriate to apply to a Jedi. Lucas did this at considerable expense, as thousands of teaser posters had already been printed, and to offset the costs, he ended up selling the remaining stock to Star Wars fan club members. Amusingly, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was originally going to be called Star Trek II: The Vengeance of Khan, but changed its title for fear for audiences confusing the two franchises, only for Lucas to ditch the word a few months after Wrath of Khan hit cinemas. Lucas finally did find an appropriate place for it in the prequel trilogy though, of course with Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Number 19, Steven Spielberg, David Lynch, and David Cronenberg were considered to direct. A number of directors were in contention to direct this film, most notably Lucas's pal Steven Spielberg, who ultimately declined due to his membership with the Directors Guild of America, an organization Lucas dropped out of due to disagreements on The Empire Strikes Back. Two far less conventional auteurs were also in the mix as well. David Lynch, in fact, was offered the directing gig but turned it down because he felt it belonged to Lucas, choosing instead to direct his ill-fated adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune the next year. David Cronenberg was also offered the job, but knowing his genre predilections, he turned it down instead for Videodrome and The Dead Zone, both of which he made that same year. Number 18, the Jabba the Hutt puppet cost $500,000 and weighed 2,000 pounds. As won't surprise anyone who knows much about practical effects, the Jabba the Hutt puppet used during the movie was a massive pain in the ass for the crew. Legendary creature designer Stuart Freeborn and his team took 3 months to build Jabba at a cost of $500,000, and the final prop ended up weighing a colossal 2,000 pounds. During shooting as well, the puppet required 3 different operators, and George Lucas was apparently unhappy with Jabba's appearance and movement on screen. I guess that explains all the CGI after the fact then. Number 17, Obi-Wan came back from the dead in an early draft of the script. Though Obi-Wan of course appears in the film as a Force ghost, an early version of the script actually had the Jedi resurrected in full corporeal form. Ultimately, the decision was made somewhere along the line not to do this, which, despite the obvious fan-serving potential of the character's resurrection, was probably for the best. Given that Star Wars has enough problems as it is with death having any finality, bringing Obi-Wan back for sentimental reasons rather than ones that made sense to the narrative would have been a massively foolhardy step in a film which already had plenty of narrative plates to spin. Number 16, every take of Leia in the bikini had to be checked for wardrobe malfunctions. One of the most iconic aspects of Return of the Jedi, for better or worse, is the slave costume worn by Princess Leia when she's captured and enslaved inside Jabba the Hutt's palace. According to an interview with Carrie Fisher though, she originally thought the costume was some kind of prank, and took umbrage with just how little flexibility she had in her performance while wearing it, with there being a very strict no crease mandate on the set. Similarly, the wardrobe department had to check that Fisher was secured inside the metal bikini before every single take to make sure that any wardrobe malfunctions didn't ruin the scene. Number 15, Admiral Akbar's "It's a trap" wasn't the original scripted line. There are a few more iconic lines in the history of Star Wars than Admiral Akbar's utterance of "It's a trap" during the Battle of Endor, which has been endlessly repeated by fans and become an internet meme in its own right. However, Akbar almost said something a little bit different, as in the script it originally dictated that he say instead, "It's a trick." As it turns out, the line was redubbed in post-production after test screenings, where Lucas and co felt that the original line simply didn't have the desired impact. Number 14, Yoda was added to the script for one particular reason. In an earlier draft of the movie, Yoda didn't actually appear in it at all, but George Lucas felt compelled to add him to ensure that audiences were acutely aware that Darth Vader was indeed Luke Skywalker's father. Lucas even went to the lengths of consulting a child psychologist during pre-production, who convinced Lucas that unless it was flat out confirmed by a trustworthy character that Vader was Luke's father, younger audiences under 12 years of age would simply reject it as being untrue. This was compounded when Vader voice actor James Earl Jones also concurred that he didn't believe that Vader was telling the truth. By having a character as impossibly wise as Yoda confirming it to Luke then, there was no reason to linger on the dubious validity of this claim. Number 13, George Lucas allegedly fired producer Gary Kurtz before production started. Gary Kurtz produced both A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, though was allegedly fired from Return of the Jedi by George Lucas before production started in earnest. Kurtz and Lucas's professional relationship had suffered from the hectic production of the previous film, which ran over budget and behind schedule. However, some sources suggest that Kurtz chose to leave Return of the Jedi due to disagreeing with its creative direction, particularly its merchandise-baiting storyline and plainly happy ending. Either way though, Kurtz was replaced by Howard G. Kazanjian, who had previously served as an executive producer for Lucas on Raiders of the Lost Ark. Number 12, Alan Rickman auditioned for Moff Gigerard. The commander of the Death Star, Moff Gigerard, was ultimately played by Michael Pennington, though a now legendary actor also auditioned for the part, the late great Alan Rickman. Years before he became an instant household name off the back of Die Hard, Rickman tried out for Moff Gigerard and apparently auditioned with a quote, big, slow, low voice, which seemingly didn't impress the filmmakers enough to give him the part. Pennington, of course, did a stellar job with the role, but the notion of Rickman playing an Imperial officer is one of cinema's all-time most agonizing what-if moments. Number 11, the first test screening was a total disaster. In fairness, none of the three original Star Wars movies have enjoyed a smooth post-production process, with A New Hope in particular basically being whipped into shape by editor Marcia Lucas. But a lot naturally hinged on Lucas and company sticking the landing with Return of the Jedi, and the first test screening of the film was, well, not good to be kind. Dubbed a quote-unquote disaster by those in attendance, George Lucas was said to be highly critical of the film's editing and generally felt that it didn't feel like a Star Wars movie. The day was saved, however, when one of the film's three editors, Sean Barton, undertook his own cut of the film, which Lucas was far more favourable to, and which served as the blueprint for the final theatrical cut. Number 10, it was shot under the codename Blue Harvest. By the time Return of the Jedi went into production, Star Wars was an out-and-out phenomenon, and so it was decided to film it under a codename. In order to throw paparazzi and inquiring fans off the scent, it was shot under the name Blue Harvest and said to be a horror film, with t-shirts and caps even being made to further sell the line. Keeping the Jabba's Palace scenes under wraps was especially difficult though, as a Dune Buggy festival with 35,000 attendees was taking place nearby, and despite the set being fenced off with 24-hour security, fans did manage to snap some photos. There was another reason for the secrecy though. Lucasfilm found that their production vendors would automatically raise their prices if they knew it was for a Star Wars movie rather than some random horror film. As for the title itself, well, it's a nod to the story Red Harvest, which inspired the classic 1961 Akira Kurosawa film Yojimbo, itself a fave of George Lucas. Number 9. George Lucas clashed with director Richard Marquand throughout filming. Though Lucas hand-selected Richard Marquand to direct Return of the Jedi, the pair reportedly clashed during shooting, in large part because Lucas favoured extensive camera coverage while Marquand, coming from a lower-budget realm of filmmaking, preferred just 1 or 2 cameras. It's been alleged by several people connected to the production, including the Empire Strikes Back director Irvin Kersner, that Marquand didn't direct all of the movie, and significant portions of it were in fact helmed by an assistant director and even Lucas himself, due to some cast members struggling to work with Marquand. Darth Vader's climactic cremation, for example, has been confirmed to have been filmed by Lucas himself. Though Lucas has generally commended Marquand as a capable director, Marquand himself said of shooting the film with Lucas's constant presence on set, quote, "It is rather like trying to direct King Lear with Shakespeare in the next room." Number 8. Ben Kingsley was considered for Emperor Palpatine. Though Ian McDiarmid was ultimately cast as Emperor Palpatine, and it's practically impossible to consider anyone having done so much with the part as he did, even in the character's wonkier prequel and sequel appearances, a bevy of other performers were also up for the role. Ben Kingsley, for instance, who had just shot Gandhi and would net him a Best Actor Oscar the year Return of the Jedi was released, was in consideration to play Palpatine, though he was apparently deemed too English and passed over for the snarling Scotsman McDiarmid. Now, as easy as it is to imagine Kingsley knocking Palpatine out the park, there's just no arguing with McDiarmid's great work in the role. Number 7. Mark Hamill hated that Leia was Luke's sister. One of Return of the Jedi's most shocking revelations is that Luke and Leia are brother and sister, especially after their eyebrow-raising smooch in The Empire Strikes Back. It wasn't just fans who found this reveal contrived and contradictory though. Mark Hamill himself at the time took umbrage with the twist, even claiming that Lucas himself came up with it last minute during production. In earlier versions of the script, Luke was going to have a separate twin sister character called Nellis Skywalker, who would tie into a much larger arc leading up to an originally planned Episode 9 as Luke sought to find Nelith. Number 6. The Ewok actors staged a prank mutiny during shooting. One of the most arduous aspects of the film's shoot was the Endor scenes, which were filmed in a forest near Crescent City, California. The treacherous forest location was similarly challenging for the Ewok actors, leading to an on-set mutiny as a large number of the Ewok performers decided to feign abandoning the set altogether. Production assistant Ian Bryce recalled making his way to the set one day and finding a note from the Ewok actors explaining that they were all fed up with their treatment and had left for the airport. In a panic, Bryce tried to follow them but ended up with a flat tire just outside the set, and once he found another car, a bus containing the Ewok actors arrived to the set with the performers all wearing Revenge of the Ewok shirts. In the end, it was all just one big elaborate prank. Number 5. Cinematographer Alan Hume resigned in the last month of production. Though Alan Hume received a full credit as the film's cinematographer, he actually ended up informally resigning from the film in the final month of production as a protest over George Lucas's treatment of director Richard Marquand. Lensing for the final month was instead completed by camera operator Alec Mills, who despite being uncredited for his contributions as DP, later went on to be the solo cinematographer on Bond films The Living Daylights and License to Kill. Number 4. George Lucas threw out months of VFX work that he didn't like. One of the single most infamous days in the production of any Star Wars movie was Return of the Jedi's Black Friday. On November 22, 1982, barely 6 months before the film's release, George Lucas decided that roughly 100 visual effects shots totaling an estimated 4 months of work and mostly taken from the film's final battle sequence weren't completed to his satisfaction and had them all thrown out. The crew at Industrial Light and Magic were forced to start again from scratch, news which allegedly prompted many crew members to get extremely drunk. Number 3. Several darker alternate endings were discussed. After the bleak ending of The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi whips back around to have an intensely happy, neatly tied up ending to send audiences home on a high. However, this wasn't always the plan, as Lucas originally toyed around with some more daring ideas. According to dismissed producer Gary Kurtz, the original script treatment concluded with Luke departing on his own, fatigued like the loner hero in a western, disappearing into the Tatooine desert. Yeah, sounds a bit familiar, that one, doesn't it? Hamill himself also discussed the idea with Lucas of Luke wearing Vader's helmet at the very end of the film, in turn creating a far more ambiguous outcome for our alleged hero. Lucas, of course, ended up rejecting both ideas in favour of a strictly happy ending, apparently for the sake of merchandise sales. Number 2, George Lucas regretted Boba Fett's death scene. One of the most baffling aspects of Return of the Jedi is the goofy then intended death of Boba Fett, a breakout character who seemed destined for much greater things, and courtesy of subsequent retcons, ultimately was. Lucas himself later admitted that he regretted giving Boba Fett such a deflating death though, having failed to realise just how popular the character had become from his appearance in The Empire Strikes Back. Lucas added that had he realised, he would have endeavoured to give the character a more meaningful and memorable death scene, and by the time he was prepping Return of the Jedi's 2004 DVD release, even considered adding a VFX shot of Fett escaping the Sarlacc pit. Number 1, director Richard Marquand has a cameo in the Battle of Endor. Director Richard Marquand simply couldn't resist giving himself a cameo in the film, and let's be totally honest, who could blame him, appearing for just a few seconds in the film's Battle of Endor as an AT-ST pilot, Major Marquand, or as he was renamed in the new canon, Newland. Marquand and his co-pilot, played by the film's co-producer Robert Watts, aren't long for this world, however, as Chewbacca soon enough wipes them both out. Marquand's easily missed considering that only the most ardent Star Wars fans could even pick him out of a lineup, but it's still a pretty fun cameo once you know.